Hello and welcome to Jerry's Live. My name is Michaela Westra and I'm going to be your host today. And today is going to be a very fun episode because I'm combining some requests that you guys offered. So if you have joined us before, I have done two shows. One of them is colored pencil and skin tone, and the other one is impressionistic oil painting. And from those two shows, on one, for the colored pencil show, you guys had questions about creating skin tones with the Cezanne water-soluble colored pencils. And for the oil painting, you wanted to know more about impressionistic watercolor. So for this one, we are combining both of those requests, and I'm going to be doing an impressionistic painting with watercolor and our watercolor pencils. So before we jump in, just a little refresher in case you were not with us for those episodes. Definitely check them out later. If you have joined us before, you will recognize this reference photo here. I chose this absolutely beautiful tree. You guys loved this reference photo, so I'm actually using the same reference photo for today. But this is what we worked on for that impressionistic oil painting. We played around with those colors, how to apply it, and how they traditionally painted these impressionistic paintings. So we're going to look at other impressionistic artists and those that used watercolor to kind of make up how we think that would look. So, like I said, I'm using this same reference photo, but since I've already painted this a couple of times, I wanted to change it up a little bit. So, I flipped it and I zoomed in. So it's a little bit of a closer up image of the same thing, so we're still doing the same reference, but changing it up just enough that it has its own kind of unique look. So, for this, I also have this man here. I did paint it in the impressionistic oil painting. I'm not going to paint him in this one because the reference photos that I have chosen to help me kind of make up this impressionistic watercolor painting, it's more just naturalistic, very simple, and I don't want to have something that's going to have a lot of detail. So I'm going to put this one away since this is the one from the last episode. And we're going to focus on this one. Now, those reference photos I mentioned, I wanted to look at previous artists that have done impressionistic watercolor paintings. And I did struggle a little bit, but I found some really good ones. This one is by John Singer Sargent. He's done quite a few impressionistic watercolors. And I also found this one, which I just thought was so interesting and fun. However, this is more of a post-impressionistic, so it's going to be a little bit different, more closer in line with pointillism, but I wanted to show this off. This is by Henry Edmund Cross, and both of these images will be provided by our lovely moderators, Amanda and Emmy. But let's go ahead and jump right in. I'm going to focus mostly on the John Singer Sargent painting to help me get that impressionistic look, but also this here. So for our materials, like I said, we're going to be using those Cezanne watercolor pencils, but I did want to tone my paper first so that I don't have to worry about covering the entire page with just my watercolored pencils in an hour. So I also added in our Turner's Artist Watercolor, the 12 set. So I'm going to start with a couple washes with just the watercolor, and then we'll jump in with those watercolor pencils. So I have the New York Central watercolor block here, the 9x12 cold press, 140 pound. I really like that texture on the cold press, and I think that's going to lean really well with the impressionistic style that we're going for. I have this beautiful porcelain tray here that I use for my watercolors, and I already have the colors I've used. I might need to add some more to it later, but I chose just a few from my Turner set. So I have the yellow ochre. I chose the permanent yellow. I really like the warmth of the sap green. I went for the, I believe it was the ultramarine, burnt umber, burnt sienna, and just a little bit of this red because I knew I wanted to add that beautiful purple that we added in the previous painting that I did. So those are the colors I had selected, added them to my little palette here in case I need them later. I'm gonna keep this up here. I know these are not in chromatic order, but it's okay. Put this off to the side. And we're gonna go ahead and start with a very simple wash because I want whatever peeks through the watercolor pencils to be something colorful. I don't want the pure white, trying to stay away from that pointillism from that post-impressionistic reference that I showed. But I'm gonna pop my reference photo up here just so you guys can see while I'm working. My reference photo I'll have over to the side here. But I'm going to start with my goat mop here. I'm going to soak my page and get a really nice wash of just the simple 3 colors I want in the background. So I also have my little Aqua Mist bottle here. I'm going to soak it so that I can add those washes just a little bit easier. And the washes of color I want in here, I'm going to start with that beautiful blue in the sky. Starting with the blue I have here. I don't want it to be too cool, so I'm gonna warm it up just a little bit with just a teensy bit of green. I'm using the center of my palette here to create my big washes. Starting at the top, just brushing back and forth, I'm going to fill the entirety of my page from edge to edge with color. If you're doing an impressionistic look, you do not have to do that. The more brushy your background is, the more it's going to lean to that impressionistic look. But I like having it be fully toned with my colors. So starting off with that blue, I do also like having a nice gradient with this watercolor. So I'm going to put a nice even wash on here, go back in with some more pure watercolor, and just let that soak in at the top, creating a really nice subtle gradient. And I don't want to do too much with this wash because I don't want this to take over the colors that I'm putting in this because I want that to be mostly those watercolored pencils. But this is just to help whatever's poking through to have a little bit of character to it. So I just went in with that sap green, little bit of blue, a little bit of red, and pop that down on the bottom. And then if you were watching for the impressionistic oil painting, I was in love with this bright yellow along the horizon here. So I'm just gonna go in, clean off my brush, and go in straight yellow to blend the sky and the grass. And maybe I'll add just a teensy bit of that green. But while I'm doing this, once you have done a wash, if you are doing a wash and you are adding colored pencil on top, you want to make sure that this is fully dry for a couple of reasons. One, once you add the colored pencil onto something wet, that pigment is going to come off super strong and it's going to stick to the paper, so it won't become super blendable. It also just goes on so much nicer when the paper is dry. So I have already done this little wash already, so I have something dry to work with, and I'm going to switch that out. So here's that same wash. This is completely dry. I let it sit for, I think, a couple hours, so it's not like still a little bit damp, it's completely dry. Now, that means we are ready for our colored pencils. I had so much fun with these. And I also did a portrait with these, just for you guys to kind of figure out how to use the watercolor pencils to create those beautiful skin tones. So actually, before I jump into finishing this landscape, put this up here, I did a kind of zoomed in portrait using those same pencils. These are the water soluble pencils. The only difference is the blender pencil has a different use. So when I was creating those really smooth combinations of color, I was layering and layering and layering those colored pencils and then using that blender stick to kind of melt those colors together. With the watercolor pencils, you don't really have to layer and layer the same way. So with these, I would lay down a really smooth, thin layer of colored pencil, and then I would put water over it so it creates a really thin, transparent layer. So that's how we're layering. We're not layering the colored pencil, colored pencil, colored pencil. You're doing colored pencil, water, let it dry, colored pencil, water, let it dry, and then you're creating those layers that way. Now, when I said the colorless blender, where did I put that? There it is. The colorless blender has a different use when you're using the watercolor pencils. It's not going to blend the wet pigment. It will help blend the dry pigment. So when you just do the colored pencils, you can blend it using the same colorless blender. If you add water after you use the colorless blender, whatever you use that colorless blender on is going to stay the same. It's not going to kind of blend away when you add the water. It's going to stay the same. So I actually use this in this portrait, mostly in the eyes. I would lay down, for example, this yellow, and then I would go over it with the colorless blender in a really kind of fun radiating pattern, and then I would put like a green on top of it. And since that colorless blender kind of saves that pigment where it is, it's not going to move, it's not going to be affected by that water quite as much, that kind of poked through and the green kind of went around my mark making. So this is super fun and definitely useful in a different way when you're using these watercolor pencils. So I'm actually not going to use these in my landscape because I'm trying to be more loose with the style, and these are fantastic with creating fun details, which is perfect for doing portraits like this. So I'm actually going to put these off to the side and put this away. I did this just for you guys. Thank you so much. I had so much fun. But let's jump back into the landscape. We have a question?
A quick question.
Yes.
Can you use these pencils on aquaboard?
You can. I have not done it personally, but aquaboard is going to have a really nice grit to it. It should work very similar to paper. It's just going to have a different texture on that hard surface. Yes.
I was wondering, do you prefer the watercolor pencils to the tubed watercolor paints?
Oh, I don't think I can answer that because they have their different uses. I think the paints are really nice for wide washes, really soft transitions. These are fantastic for detailed watercolors, kind of more textured watercolor, because sometimes when you add that colored pencil on there, you can retain that colored pencil texture once you add that water on there. It depends on how wet your paper is, by the way. If you do not want any of that colored pencil texture, always make sure your paper is completely dry when you add that on there. But yeah, I don't know if I have a preference. I think it really depends on what I'm doing. Okay, so the colored pencil set here, this is a set of 72, and it actually comes with its own little paintbrush, which I always struggle There we go. This is a round 4. This was the only thing I used when I was doing that portrait. This is fantastic for those small details, small blending. Since I'm doing something a little bit more impressionistic, I want something loose. So I'm going for slightly bigger brushes, not that much bigger, but that's definitely going to help with being loose, having those bigger brushes. I will add this to my little collection here. But this has 3 different layers of color to choose from. And I love having so many colors to choose from. The set also comes with this beautiful color chart. I did fill it out so you guys can see. This is going to be super fun and important because these pigments can kind of look different once the water is added. So if you are choosing something based on the colored pencil and then you add water to it, maybe it's going to be too saturated. So seeing what it looks like when the water is added is definitely going to help you decide which colors you want to add where. Now I'm going to put this off to the side as well and kind of choose my colors so that I can have more space. So when I'm choosing my colors, I'm looking at this. I know I want to saturate this. I want to keep the sky nice and muted, so I probably won't add too much colored pencil back there. And it's also very flat, so I don't want to add too much texture, which I'm going to try and add quite a bit with those colored pencils. So I'm going to focus mostly on the grass here, the trunk, and the trees. Again, I'm removing this little man here. So in the trunk, it has really nice yellows. This shadow, I like to lean towards blues and purples. And in between, it's kind of gray, but I'm going to lean again towards the blues and purples. So I'm going to go ahead and choose those. I love this nice purple as kind of an in-between grayish color. And just like I was saying when we were doing the portrait, again, if you haven't seen that, check that out after the show. But in our colored pencil skin tone show, I was talking about using multiple colors to create one. So it gives it a little bit more depth. So I also wanted kind of a deep magenta. I'm just going to say it out loud as I choose them. But I know I really want a nice light green, beautiful yellows, grab a couple of those. And while I'm choosing these, I always like to choose a color to avoid, if that makes sense. That kind of helps me narrow down my color palette. So I think I'm going to, maybe I'll stay away from the purples and just lean more to like a red purple. So I'm going to put this back and lean more into a red. Just gonna grab a couple of these. I like a variation of colors when I choose one, so if I'm choosing a yellow, I like a light and a dark, or even 3, so a light, a medium, and a dark. That definitely helps bring a little bit more dimension to something that is just one color. Grab a couple more greens. And I think I will add just one brown to help me kind of tone some things down. Of course, some blues. I love adding blues into my shadows. All right. So I think I'm going to call this my color palette, and then I'm going to put the rest of these off to the side. Okay. And just because I'm going to put these in chromatic order the best I can. Beautiful. Okay. So, nice and organized. Got my reference photos, my brushes. I'm not going to be using this watercolor anymore because I'm going to focus mostly on the pencils now. So I'm going to put this off to the side as well. Okay, so I'm going to start off by drawing in that trunk. So I'll start with, I'm going to start with this nice pink here. And just slowly sketching out where that is. And I want to start with the trunk instead of the horizon because it's going to be sitting in front of the horizon. That's just going to help me figure out where that tree is better. But again, just going back and forth, constantly moving my eyeballs between where my hand is and where my reference photo is. That's definitely going to help you do a quick sketch. And you don't want to focus on one area for too long because, again, this is going to be an impressionistic painting. I want it to be very loose in the impression of a tree and less of, this is a very pretty tree. So, being pretty loose, I don't want to get bogged down in these branches, just the prominent ones. And keep in mind when you are choosing your colors that everything you add down will eventually be picked up when you add the water. So that's all I'm going to do for my tree. I might kind of sketch in the trunk here, or the roots. I'm curious, let us know in the chat if you joined us for both the Impressionistic oil painting and the skin tones with colored pencil. I'm very excited for my regulars to come back and check out this, this show. So I know it's very light right now, but I just did a very loose sketch of my tree. Now I'm going to go in with my yellow. This is going to be very light and very similar to what I have on there right now. But I'm going to go in and press down pretty hard and draw out my horizon. And now that my tree is there, I don't have to worry about figuring out where that is going to be. And now that I have this sketched in, I'm going to start layering in something that I can blend with the water. So I want this to be really nice, bright yellow. And I'm going to go in and just add in a nice thin layer along the horizon. And I like that glowing horizon look. So I want to make sure that the top of the horizon and the grass is going to be very light, and the bottom of the sky is going to be very light as well, where they touch. So I'm going to go in with a slightly darker yellow and find those shadows. Some of those bright spots. And again, when you're doing something impressionistic, working fast is going to help in your favor. Alright. Keeping that really nice and yellow, I'm going to actually jump into that shadow because that shadow is just so juicy. And I'm going to go for a beautiful blue and finding those shadows, again, working quickly, working loosely. I can always blend, and when I'm adding these colored pencils in, I'm putting in kind of a lighter, not like pressing down super, super hard unless you want a defining line, but I'm kind of pressing down a little bit lightly. And when you add the water, there is a chance that the more water you add, the lighter that color is going to get again. So I'll show you that in just a minute. since I don't have a lot of time to let my paper dry in between steps, I'm going to add as many steps as possible before I add the water into one part, so I don't kind of have a wet surface to work on. But I will show you that just so you can see what it looks like to work on a wet paper. Going to define this gray area here. And to lean into gray, I'm going to go for this purple. It's going to mix with that green and kind of neutralize. Alright, now there is a green that I absolutely love that looks a little bit different once it is added with water. This olive green, I absolutely love this color. So I'm going to go for that. That is this 42. And I'm going to add this almost entirely to the bottom here. I want this to be the main color of my grass. And if you are working on paper that is a little bit damp, you might want to be careful with the direction that you are coloring in, because again, sometimes that texture of the colored pencil on the paper can remain. Do we have any other questions while I'm adding some green? All right. Now, just like when we're adding colors into skin tones, I like to make sure I'm overlapping color. And just like I was saying when I was showing you that eyeball painting drawing, what would you call a combination of painting and drawing? What medium is this? Painting and drawing?
I mean, it's watercolor.
Mm-hmm.
Just
In stick form.
Drawing?
Prawing? Okay. But usually I like to wait before I layer, but I'm going to kind of combine that just because we have a little bit of time, and I want to show you guys as much as possible. So I'm doing my layering now, making sure I'm overlapping my colors. I like to have at least 2 colors on top of each other. That's going to create a more unique color, a little bit more dimension, and a little bit more interest. I went in with that really yellow green to kind of blend the deep olive green with that bright yellow. I'm going to go in with a nice cool green now. I'm going to go in for those really subtle shadows that are in the grass there. So we have a really nice shadow over here. And again, this is going to look different once you add that water on there. Some colors are going to appear more prominent, some are going to lighten. It's all going to kind of shift once you start adding water. I think I'm also going to add this to the edges of my blue shadows, just so it's a little bit softer. Gotta make sure I don't focus on one area too much because I can get stuck in those details. Alright, gonna add a little bit more of a blue to my shadows just to darken them up in some spots, and then we'll start adding some water because that is definitely where the fun part is at.
Now, if you're trying to avoid the texture of the paper, would you suggest maybe using a different type of paper?
Yeah, that can definitely help. If you have a hot press paper, very light pressure, you'll get very little texture. I did want to retain some texture because I like the idea of seeing the texture in the final painting, especially with this John Singer Sargent. You can definitely see that nice cold press texture in there.
Michaela, I think I know the answer is yes, but Does that color chart that you filled in, it comes with the set?
It does. Yep, it comes with the set. It comes blank, so you can fill it out yourself. You can fill it out however you want. If you want to show a gradation of like pressing down really hard to really light and then adding the water, you can fill it out however you like so that you can get an understanding for how these work and you do it yourself. So I love when you can fill out your own color charts.
Thank you.
Of course. Okay, so now I have a few layers of colored pencil on here. I'm going to go ahead and start adding some of that water. I'm going to use my 8 round. This is my Mimic Squirrel. These, I love these for watercolor. They hold a nice amount of water and they're super soft. So I'm going to start with my lighter areas, and I'm going to start with very little water and very few brushes over one spot, because the more water you add and the more you scrub at it, the lighter and more washy that's going to get. And again, like I said, I want to retain some of that texture and that saturation. And once you kind of remove that pigment from the surface and it's floating in that water that you add, you can move it around quite a bit. You can also fully erase it. If you are using very light pressure and then you add quite a bit of water, you can almost fully erase this from your paper. So I like to go from my lights into my darks, but I'm going to clean my brush in between so I don't have to worry too much about it. But this is the magic in the watercolor version. In the skin tone with the normal colored pencils, adding that colorless blender to melt all those colors together, that was what everyone described as magic, and it really was. It was so much fun to see that. But with the water, that's where you get in that magic with these pencils. And I'll go ahead and scrub in one spot so you can kind of see how much you can remove that texture. You can really control it if you control your water. But you can kind of see the more water you add, the less of that colored pencil texture you see, and the less water you add, the more you're going to retain that texture. So it really depends on the outcome you're looking for, but this has a lot of potential in so many ways. I had so much fun using these. So this, as it's coming out, is what I would consider for this painting to be more of a basic underpainting. I would probably go over this 2 or 3 more times. I'm going to move into the trunk though, so I can let this dry a little bit. Though actually, since I want some texture in the grass, I'm going to add it on top of the wet so you can see what that looks like. So I'm going to go back in with my olive green. Looking at my reference here, it gets pretty dark in this corner. And once you add it on, I'm barely touching the surface here. Once you add it onto wet paper, that pigment is going to become very stark. And however you brush this on, that texture is going to remain adhering to that surface of the paper. So again, I'm barely touching the surface, but that water is mixing with the pigment in the pencil and really mixing like on contact. Adding some of this to my shadows. Not quite wet enough over there, so I'm actually going to add just a little bit of water so I can get the same texture I was getting on the other side. but you can see just how dark that gets when you add just the colored pencil to a wet paper. Now let's go ahead and add some water. You can see that it does blend out, but that texture is going to remain sticking to those raised points on that cold press paper. And again, if that's something you want to avoid, definitely using a hot press paper, something that's smoother, and working dry onto dry. Alright, I'm going to move into my trunk. And I'm going to start with my yellows. I'm going to lean more to an orange because I want to have a little bit of differentiation between the horizon and the highlights in my tree. So I'm going to go in and find those highlights, and again, working quickly, laying those down. And if you are working to retain that texture of the colored pencil, again, making sure you're conscious of the marks you're making. So when you're working on a tree trunk, creating little curved lines to form a 3D shape definitely helps with that. And I love the highlight on the base of this trunk here. And I'm going to go for a more purple and blue. So I have this deep kind of magenta color. I'm going to fill my whole tree in where those dark parts are with this color. And I feel like these work a little bit faster than colored pencil, but it does still require quite a bit of time and layering. I like to work really light and layer those light passes. Again, trying not to get too focused on those details. I always get stuck into really nice areas. And I love this moss hanging off of this branch here. It's so fun to do with a pencil. Really easy strokes. Alright, and to push it more towards a purple, I'm going to go in with this blue on top. We have some questions?
Yes. Alan on Facebook said that you mentioned doing about 3 more layers, and he was wondering, will you let each layer dry in between?
Yes, I would. If you really like that texture, you do not have to. I'm trying to control where that texture is, so typically I would like to let it fully dry so I can kind of control it more. But it also depends on what exactly you're drawing. So, yes and no. It depends on what you're doing, but being aware of how to control it is going to help you figure out which one you want to do. You had another question?
I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. Would you rather paint with just watercolors rather than using the watercolor pencils? Like, wouldn't that be a little faster?
Yes. This is going to be typically really good for those really small details. Not typically for impressionistic work, but I thought this combination would be super fun. So typically I would see this as really helpful for getting those really tiny details when you're working with watercolor. So for example, with that portrait I did, it's going to be hard to get those eyelashes and those eye details and the eyebrows. You can get really nice saturated line work that's really crispy when you're doing something with these pencils. Now, since this is going to be super purple, I want to tone it down a little bit. I have this really nice brown. I'm going to be kind of careful where I put this because I want to keep it pretty saturated, but just not too saturated. So I'm going to go in those really dark areas where it's almost either black or gray, where I don't really see any prominent color. I'm going to add this to tone it down. Maybe add some to my moss. I do like when that moss is really bright purple. So I'm going to go back in and kind of darken that up. Maybe add a little bit more in here. But I'm not going to I'm trying not to get too bogged down. Another way to tone down that blue is a really nice orange. So I'll put a little bit of that orange on top of that blue. Again, it's going to look a little bit different once you add the water on there. So doing a quick color study is definitely going to help you if you're doing a really nice big piece or a commission piece. Being able to see how they work together is definitely going to help. Alright, let's go ahead and add some water to this, see how it looks. I'm going to go for my smaller brush here, so I have a 4 round. This is the same brush that comes with the set. I just like this one because it has a little bit longer of a handle. And I went for smaller because it's a smaller area. You do not have to fill out this completely with water. If you like that, what it looks like before you add water, you do not have to add that. It's going to add really nice variation. Again, the more you brush over it, the less you're going to see those pencil marks. And once we have this, we're going to let it dry, do another coat on here. Something that I noticed when I was working with these is once I add the water, sometimes it gets oversaturated. So now that I know that this area over here is going to be super pink, I'm going to go over it with some greens or maybe just like a blue-green to tone it down. But we're going to go into those leaves next and let that dry. Okay, for my leaves, I'm going to work in kind of clumps. So if you watched the Impressionistic oil painting, I worked in clumpy sections. I'm going to go for, let me use my chart here. I'm going to go for the 43 here, something a little bit different from the grass. And I'm going to be careful because I see this really wet branch here. If I want that texture, I don't have to worry about it. But since only part of this is wet, I don't want to have texture here and no texture here. So I'm going to avoid this section. I'm going to find those clumps and I'm just going to scribble it in. Since I'm adding water on top of this and I want more of a wash for this step, I don't have to worry too much as long as I'm adding light pressure. I'm just going to block out those areas. And this is going to be a long process for this step because I want to start with a wash for my leaves to sit on top of. So I have green instead of blue underneath. Then I'm going to go in with my highlights, make sure those highlights are nice and bright and yellow. And then I'm going to go in with my darks and kind of define those clumps. And I'll probably do that while the paper is wet, so again, I can retain that really nice texture. But knowing how they work definitely helps me plan and figure out when I'm doing what and how. I like this little branch sticking off to the side here. Alright, and I'm just going to fill this in so I have more green to work with in the middle. But now I got my shape. Go back in with my size 8 brush. And I'm just treating this like a wash. So I'm just adding quite a bit of water so I have something nice to overlap my branches as I do this, so I don't have separation line. And you can see as I'm adding water just how thin these layers are and how much you can layer up these thin washes. You can also go in with just really dark color, pressing down really hard, and start with a darker wash. I like to start really light and work it up layer by layer. But once this is done, my grass should be dry enough to jump back into. Alright. Perfect. Alright, we're going to jump back into our grass, and some things I noticed that I wanted to do is I want to brighten up this section, so I'm going to go in with some yellow. I want to add a little bit more definition over here, and I want to add these really nice fence posts. It's just a really nice added detail since I'm not having that man in there. There's also a little sheep. I don't know if you see that. There's a tiny little sheep in there. I'm not going to add him, but I really like that concept of just repeating lines in the background, so I'm going to add those in as well. So let's go ahead and brighten up our grass. I'm going to go for this beautiful yellow-green. I might go in with just some straight yellow too. But again, it's going to be hard to see until you add that water, so trust the process. Go in with this nice warm yellow. And I want to add a little bit more blue to those shadows. I like when it's a nice bright blue peeking through. It's especially fun when you have a highly saturated piece. If you have something that's green, creating the highlights that are yellow and the shadows blue creates a nice variation of that green. I have a question?
Yeah, Nola was wondering, once you wet the colors and they dry, will they reactivate or are they permanent?
They do reactivate just a little bit, but not too much. It depends also on how much of that wash you have. So let's go ahead and try to erase something that we already did. Again, try not to look at the parts that I did on wet paper, because again, that's going to adhere to the paper. But let's go ahead and see if this reactivates here. It does a little bit, but it doesn't shift all that much. So once you add that water, I wouldn't say it's permanent, but it's going to be harder to remove. Alright, let's add a little bit more variation back here. I got this yellow-green again. And something nice about adding line work, I'm going to go for this deep blue. is once you add it and then go over it with a really thin brush, it's going to be a really nice stark line. So right now it looks like colored pencil, but let's go in with that round 2. And just on top of where I put that, it will become just slightly darker and a little bit more defined. So I love doing the line work with these. And again, I just kind of brought this too far, so I'm erasing it with some extra water. And for a little bit of shadow, I'm gonna brush the bottom of these so they feel like they're sitting. Alright, I also want this to be more green, so I'm gonna go in with just a normal green here. And we are getting already close to the end. I do have a final image, so if I don't finish, I can show you what I was aiming for while I was working today. And I am pressing down a little bit harder for this step so I can have a little bit more of a saturated coating.
When you get a moment, can you pull that up a little bit higher so that we can see the details of those colors that you're putting in?
Sure.
Thank you.
So the color change is pretty subtle right now, but once I add that water, I'm sure that saturation is going to pop out. Put my pencils back over here. Going back with that large 8. Added a little bit of yellow-green over here. And lots of yellow over here to brighten it up. I do want to make sure I at least go back in and tone down that tree and add a couple of leaves. But now is the time if you have any final questions. We're getting close to wrapping up already. Okay. So I'm going to call the ground good for now. Again, I don't want to get too detailed. I want to be very loose. So I might go back in and kind of remove my nice straight lines if I want to be more loose. Again, I'm trying to be super fast with this, but I get so stuck in those beautiful details that I really want to bring out. So back into this tree, it became very pink. So in order to tone that down, the opposite of that is going to be a green. But I don't want to add too much green to this, so I'm going to go for more of a teal. I don't have that out here, so I'm going to use my color chart here. I really like this teal here, so I'm going to go for 62. Which is this one here. Just to tone down that pink that's showing up in the tree. It is still a little damp, but I'm not too worried about it. You can see where the paper is wet, that's where it's gotten really dark. But since that has gotten really blue, I'm going to go back in with my brown and maybe some orange, because I want this to be the more of a neutral. Again, you see where that paper is wet, that's where it's getting really dark. Alright. Go ahead and add water, see how the color is looking. did want the trunk to be one of the more neutral areas in the painting. Probably go in with some more blue. Again, I'm trying to focus on lighting, nice saturation, and more about kind of what you, when you look at it and you squint, the idea and the shape and the lighting is what I'm focusing on. Going to add a little bit more blue to some of my moss here because I want it to lean more purple, less pink. Have another question?
Yes, Eric on YouTube was wondering if you are not a patient person, is there a good way to speed up the drying process when you apply that water?
Absolutely. I like to use this handy dandy gadget. It is called a hairdryer. If you do not have that, letting it sit in a warm area in the sun. But hair dryers are so useful when you're working with something that you need to dry quickly. So acrylic paint and watercolor, it's definitely super duper helpful. Alright. Let's go ahead and add some leaves and then we're going to call today done. Moved by so quickly. Alright. So I said I was going to start with those highlights in the tree, go into the leaves and the shadows. So let's find those highlights. I'm going to press down pretty hard. It's still a little damp, so you'll be able to see where it's still wet when this becomes super dark and vibrant. Again, I'm kind of scribbling, being a little bit more organic with my scribbles now because I'm most likely going to see them when I hit a wet patch. But for something like this, I like to start with those highlights so I can have those already established and then I can avoid them when I add those shadows. And I'm actually going to blend this in now because I want to do the next step on something that is wet. So I'm going to add water to these little bright areas. Again, you can see this area right here was wet already, so it has that deeper pigment already sticking to the paper there. Honestly, a painting with just these pencils on wet paper would look so cool. Okay, so I'm going to add this to the rest of my leaves because I want this whole thing to be wet for this next step. Were there any final questions, or are we... Alright, beautiful. Okay, so I'm going to go in with my darker green, create my clumpies. Again, being natural with my scribbles here. I want to be loose, but since I'm working on wet, I'm going to have all of this remain. Even once I add water, this is going to stick. I love this olive green. I'm obsessed with it. Okay. I'm not going to do too much. I do want to add a little bit of blue. I always love adding blue to those shadows, like I said before. So just to help finish up, adding just a little bit of this really nice kind of warm blue. Really helps create a little bit of dimension with those greens if I have another color. But let's move this color around a little bit, keeping those really nice scribbles that I added, but moving around that color. And if you have not worked with these New York Central watercolor blocks, they are so good for working on really wet paintings because watercolor paper will warp as you're working, and having something that's already stretched on all sides is going to help keep that flat, especially once it dries. And while we're on that topic, once you are done with a painting like this, you will use a palette knife to remove it from the block. You do want to make sure that your painting is completely dry so that it can dry in this flat shape again. There is a little tab down here at the bottom, and you will take a palette knife, stick it in there, slide it across, and you'll go all the way around to remove that paper from the block. Now, since we are done, and I did not finish this today, I'm going to show you what I was aiming for. Oh no! So I did probably after that point, I did probably 2 more layers of adding color on top of color, letting things dry so I can control the texture that I'm creating in the washes. But I was aiming for that super loose, fun, textured, saturated image. But I hope you guys had fun today, and I hope you enjoyed watching along. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, our class code for today is JL342. If you pop that in JerrysArtarama search bar, it'll show you everything we used tonight, so definitely check that out. Another thing to check out is our Facebook page. If you followed along today or you follow along later on and you want to share what you did, or even just share what you did in a previous show, whatever you want to share with us, join our Facebook group. Do not forget we have that one security question before you can join. But again, thank you so much for joining us. I had so much fun. Things moved along so quick today, but we're so excited to see you next week. We have Emmy and Ophelia on to talk about watercolor. So definitely check that out, and we'll see you next week. Bye!